I want to tell you something that I still find hard to believe happened to me. Not because it was complicated, or because the people involved were strangers, but because the people who did this to me were the same ones who had sat at my dinner table for 26 years, who had eaten my food, accepted my hospitality, and called me family, right up until the moment it was no longer convenient for them to do so. My name is Jennifer. I'm 54 years old. And almost 2 years ago now, I came home from a weekend trip with my 17-year-old daughter to find the locks on our front door had been changed. That's where this story begins. But to understand it, to really understand how something like that happens, I have to take you back much further than that Sunday afternoon. If you're new here, please subscribe. It helps the channel grow and reach more people. Now let's get started. I met Thomas Calloway when I was 26 years old at a friend's birthday dinner in Portland. He was 30, quiet in a way that felt considered rather than shy, and he had this habit of listening, really listening, that I had never encountered in a man before. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in the backyard of his parents' home in Beaverton. We bought a house together in the Selwood neighborhood, close to the river, with a big kitchen and a yard that needed work. We were happy. I want to say that plainly because this story will get dark, and I don't want the darkness to erase what came before it. We were genuinely, ordinarily happy. Thomas worked in logistics management. I worked as a medical billing coordinator. We had Lily when I was 37, late enough that we had stopped expecting it, early enough that we still had the energy to be surprised by joy. The house was in Thomas's name. That was never a secret, never a source of tension. When we bought it, I had a complicated credit history from a period in my late 20s I'm not proud of, and the mortgage was simpler with just his name on it. We always meant to fix that, to transfer, to refinance, to formalize what was already real between us. The way you mean to do a lot of things when you're busy and in love and time feels endless. We never got around to it. Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of his 55th year. He was gone by October of the same year, 9 months from diagnosis to burial. I don't have words for that kind of loss that don't feel like an insult to the size of it. I will only say that Lily was 15 when her father died, and that watching her absorb that grief was the hardest thing I have ever witnessed. We survived. The way you survive things you never imagined surviving. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one ordinary Tuesday at a time until ordinary Tuesdays stop feeling like a cruelty and start feeling like a gift. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that while Thomas was dying, his family was already planning what would come next. The Calloways were a tight family. I had understood that from the beginning. Thomas had one brother, Dwayne, 4 years older, who lived with his wife, Patricia, in a large house in Lake Oswego. Their mother, Ruth, lived in a retirement community in Teagard, sharp as a tack at 78, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never once slouched in her life. I had always found a way to coexist with them. That is the most honest way I can put it. Dwayne was the kind of man who talked over people without noticing, who had opinions about everything and expertise in nothing, who treated kindness as weakness and called it realism. Patricia was quieter, but watched everything, the way a person watches when they are keeping score. Ruth was formal in a way that felt pointed, always polite, always just slightly out of reach, as though full warmth was a resource she had decided not to waste on me. Thomas loved them, and because he loved them, I found a way to love them too, or at least to make peace with them, which for 26 years amounted to the same thing. At holidays, I cooked. At family gatherings, I organized. When Ruth needed rides to medical appointments before she moved to the retirement community, I was the one who took her. When Dwayne and Patricia went through a rough patch in their marriage around 2015, it was my kitchen table they sat at, my coffee they drank, my listening they leaned on. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what I believed our relationship was. I believed it was imperfect, complicated, and real. I believed that whatever tensions existed between us were the ordinary frictions of family, annoying, occasionally painful, but not dangerous. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that took me a long time to fully comprehend. Thomas deteriorated quickly after the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer is brutal in that way. It moves fast, and it moves without mercy. By June, he was on strong pain medication. By August, he could no longer drive or work. By September, he was in hospice care. At home, in the bedroom we had shared for over 2 decades. The Callaways were present during those months, more present than they had ever been in our marriage, actually. Dwayne came over 2 or 3 times a week. Patricia brought food, always more than we needed, always with a performance of generosity that somehow felt like an occupation. Ruth called daily, and sometimes Dwayne would bring her over and they would sit with Thomas while I handled the crushing administrative machinery of dying. The insurance calls, the prescription pickups, the hospice coordination, the fielding of well-meaning neighbors. I was grateful for the help. I was exhausted and terrified, and any relief felt like oxygen. I did not notice then what was happening in those quiet hours when I was not in the room. Thomas died on the 14th of October, on a Tuesday morning, with Lily and me beside him. The hospice nurse was there. It was as peaceful as that kind of thing can be. I held his hand until it was no longer warm. 3 days later, Dwayne asked to meet with me. He said it was about the estate. I assumed it was a practical conversation. Insurance, accounts, the ordinary paperwork of loss. I made us both coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table that had been in my house for 16 years. He told me Thomas had left a will. I said yes, of course. We had both made wills years ago, simple documents that left everything to each other and then to Lily. Dwayne said this was a different will, a more recent one. He slid a copy across the table. The document was dated August 22nd of that year, less than 2 months before Thomas died. It listed the house, our house, the Selwood house, the house where Lily had grown up and Thomas had died, and I had built 26 years of my life, as a bequest to Ruth Calloway. I sat there and I read it twice. And then I looked up at Dwayne. He looked back at me with an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It was not cruel exactly. It was something worse than cruel. It was composed, patient, the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment for quite some time and had long since made his peace with it. Thomas wanted to make sure the family property stayed in the family, he said. I asked him what that meant. It means the house goes to Mom, he said. You and Lily will need to make other arrangements. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it matters. The first thing I felt was confusion. Pure, blank confusion. The kind your brain produces when it receives information it has no framework to process. I actually thought, for a few seconds, that I had misunderstood something, that there was a mistake, that Dwayne was telling me about someone else's house. Then the confusion became something colder. I asked Dwayne when he had learned about this will. He said Thomas had discussed it with him over the summer. I asked if Thomas had discussed it with me. There was a pause. Just a small one. Thomas made his wishes clear to the family, Dwayne said. Not an answer. I noticed that. I told Dwayne I needed time to process this, and I needed to speak with an attorney before any further conversations took place. He nodded as though this was entirely reasonable, stood up, thanked me for the coffee, and left. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he drove away. The house was quiet. Lily was at school. The hospice equipment had been picked up the day before. The bedroom at the end of the hall was just a bedroom, again, ordinary and unbearable. I thought about Thomas. I thought about August 22nd, the state he had been in by then, the medications he was taking, the way he sometimes didn't recognize the nurses who came to the house. I thought about Dwayne's visits, about all those hours I had spent on the phone with insurance companies while Dwayne sat with my husband in our bedroom. I thought about the expression on Dwayne's face across the kitchen table. And I understood, slowly, the way you understand something you don't want to understand, that this had not been an accident, that this had not been Thomas's wish, that something had been done to my husband while he was too sick and too medicated to protect himself from it. I did not say this out loud to anyone yet. I was still a widow of 3 days, sitting alone in a quiet house. But I filed it away, and I started paying attention in a different way than I had before. I found an attorney named Carol Sutherland through a recommendation from a colleague at work. She specialized in estate law, and when I brought her the copy of the will and explained the circumstances, she did not seem surprised. She asked careful questions. She asked about Thomas's medical state in August. She asked about his medications. She asked who had been present when the document was signed and who had witnessed it. The witnesses, it turned out, were Dwayne Calloway and a woman named Sandra Price, a longtime friend of Ruth's who I had met perhaps twice in my marriage. Carol told me that a will signed by someone who lacked testamentary capacity, the legal term for the mental ability to understand what you are signing and what it means, could be challenged. She told me we would need medical documentation. We would need the hospice records, the physician's notes, the medication logs. We would need to establish concretely that Thomas had not been in a state to make binding legal decisions on August 22nd. I told her I would get everything she needed. She also told me something else. She told me to keep the information quiet for now, not to confront the Calloways, not to signal that I was building a case. She told me that people who do what the Calloways appeared to have done tend to move faster when they feel threatened. I took her advice. I went home. I made dinner. I helped Lily with her homework, and I said nothing. The months that followed were strange. The Calloways behaved as though everything was already settled, as though I had accepted what Dwayne told me and was simply taking my time making arrangements to leave. Patricia called once to ask, with elaborate casualness, whether I had started thinking about next steps. Ruth sent a card at Thanksgiving, a card, not a call, that wished us well in our new chapter. I responded to all of it politely, pleasantly even. I had become very good in those months at keeping my face still. Meanwhile, Carol and I were building our case. The hospice records were detailed and damning. Thomas's medication log for August showed he had been on a combination of opioid painkillers and anti-anxiety medication that his primary care physician, Dr. Ellen Marsh, later confirmed would have significantly impaired his cognitive function. In her written statement, Dr. Marsh said that by mid-August, Thomas would have had difficulty understanding complex documents or the long-term implications of legal decisions. She said he was not, in her professional assessment, capable of providing informed consent to a document of that nature during that period. We also found something else. Thomas had seen an attorney, a different attorney, not the one who had drawn up our original wills, in early August. That attorney, a man named Gerald Peck, whose office was in Lake Oswego, had prepared the new will. Carol reached out to his office. Under the circumstances, and with some pressure regarding the ethical obligations involved, we eventually learned that the appointment had been arranged not by Thomas, but by Dwayne. That Dwayne had brought Thomas to the office, that Thomas had seemed, in the attorney's own words, not entirely present. Gerald Peck, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable. He had not asked enough questions at the time. He knew it. Carol told me we had enough to file. I told her to proceed. I want to stop here and tell you about Lily, because she is part of this story in a way that I think matters. Lily was 16 by the time I filed the legal challenge, quiet, serious, with her father's way of listening and my stubbornness, which I say with love. She knew something was happening. Children always know. I had tried to protect her from the details. She had lost her father 8 months earlier, and I did not want to add the weight of this to what she was already carrying. But one evening in the spring, she sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, tell me what's going on." I looked at her for a moment, and then I told her, "Not everything." not the legal intricacies, not the names of medications and physicians, but the shape of it, that her uncle and grandmother had tried to take our home, that I was fighting it, that I believed we would be all right. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dad wouldn't have done that," she said, not as a question. "No," I said, "he wouldn't have." She nodded. She got up, poured herself a glass of water, and said, "Okay, what can I do to help?" She was 16 years old. I had to look away for a moment so she wouldn't see me cry. The legal process was slow. These things always are. There were depositions, document requests, back and forth between attorneys. The Calloway family hired a lawyer, a sharp one, from a firm in downtown Portland. And for a while, it felt like the weight of what I was up against was very real. Dwayne, in his deposition, said that Thomas had been clear-eyed and decisive in August, that he had expressed for years a desire to keep the house in the Calloway family, that Jennifer, he called me Jennifer throughout, never my sister-in-law, had always known the house was not legally hers. Patricia's deposition was shorter and more careful. She said she had not been present for any conversations about the will. She said she had no reason to doubt that Thomas had made his wishes clear. Ruth's deposition was the one that stayed with me longest. She was 78 years old, sharp and composed, sitting across a conference table in an attorney's office with her hands folded in her lap. Carol asked her when she had first learned about the revised will. Ruth said Thomas had told her himself in August that he wanted to ensure the house came back to the family. Carol asked whether Ruth had had any conversations with Dwayne about the house before Thomas made that statement. Ruth said she didn't recall the specifics. Carol asked whether Ruth had been aware that Thomas was on significant pain and anxiety medication during the period when the will was signed. Ruth said she was aware that Thomas was ill. Carol asked whether it had occurred to Ruth that a document signed under those circumstances might not reflect Thomas's genuine, informed wishes. Ruth looked at Carol for a moment. Then she said very calmly, "My son wanted his mother taken care of. I don't think there's anything wrong with that." There it was. Not guilt, not shame, just the clean, unhesitating conviction of a woman who had decided that what she wanted was what was right, and who had never seriously entertained another possibility. I have thought about that moment many times since, about what it means to be that certain, about how much damage a person can do while believing completely that they are justified. The challenge hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in September, almost a full year after Thomas had died. The night before, I could not sleep. I lay in the dark in the bedroom at the end of the hall and I thought about Thomas. The real Thomas. The one who had listened and laughed and built a life with me for 26 years. I thought about what he would have said if he could have seen what his family had done in his name. I thought he would have been devastated. Not surprised, maybe. He had known Dwayne his whole life, but devastated and furious in that quiet way he had. The way that was worse than shouting. I thought about Lily, asleep down the hall, about everything I needed to do this for. I got up at 4 a.m. and made tea and sat in the kitchen until the sky began to lighten. Then I got dressed and drove to the courthouse. I have to tell you now about the weekend that became the turning point, not legally, but personally, because the legal process, in the end, moved toward its conclusion with a kind of slow, grinding inevitability. But there was a moment before that resolution that I need you to understand. It was in November, about 6 weeks after the hearing. Carol had told me she was cautiously optimistic. The medical evidence was strong. The circumstances of the signing were documented. We were waiting. Lily had a school trip that weekend, a college visit to Eugene with her AP class. I drove her to school Friday morning, kissed her goodbye, and decided, on something like impulse, to spend the weekend visiting my friend Diane in Astoria. Diane and I had been friends since college. She knew everything that had been happening. She was the kind of friend who fed you soup and didn't require you to perform being fine. I left Friday afternoon. I was gone 2 nights. I came home Sunday evening. The locks on the front door had been changed. I stood on my own front porch, key in hand, and tried the lock 3 times before I understood what was happening. Then I tried the back door, also changed. Every window I could reach was locked from the inside. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Dwayne. I called him back. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, pleasantly, infuriatingly calm. "Jennifer," he said, "I've been trying to reach you." I asked him what he had done to my house. He said that in light of the pending legal proceedings, the family had decided it was in everyone's interest to secure the property. He said Ruth, as the named beneficiary in the will, had the right to take reasonable steps to protect her inheritance. He said I was welcome to collect personal belongings at a mutually agreed time, with someone present. I stood on my front porch in the November cold, and I listened to my brother-in-law tell me that my home was not my home, in the same tone a person uses to explain a parking policy. I want to tell you what I felt. I felt something that was not quite rage and not quite fear, but somewhere between the two. A kind of white clarifying fury that I had never felt before and have not felt since. The kind of feeling that burns away everything that isn't essential and leaves you very, very clear. I told Dwayne that what he had done was illegal, that entering and resecuring a property in the middle of a legal challenge was not a right his mother had, regardless of what any contested will said, that I would be speaking to my attorney within the hour. He said he was confident the family's position would be upheld. I hung up. I called Carol. She answered immediately, which told me she had been expecting something like this. She told me to take photos of every door, every window, every lock. She told me to call the non-emergency police line and report an unlawful lockout. She told me to go to Diane's or somewhere safe for the night, and that she would be filing an emergency motion first thing Monday morning. I took the photos. I made the call. A police officer came, took my report, and confirmed that yes, what had been done was a civil matter, but that the documentation would be useful. He could not force entry on my behalf without a court order, but my documentation would help get one. I drove back to Astoria. I called Lily from Diane's kitchen and told her there had been a small problem with the house, and she should come to Diane's when the bus brought the students back Sunday night. I kept my voice even. I told her not to worry. She came at 10 o'clock that night. She walked into Diane's living room, looked at my face, and said, "They did something, didn't they?" It wasn't a question. I told her what had happened, all of it this time, without softening any edges. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "They actually thought that would work?" And in spite of everything, in spite of the locked doors and the November cold and the year of grief and legal battles and the weight of all of it, I laughed. A real laugh, sudden and startled and genuine. "I don't think they expected me to fight back the way I did," I said. Lily looked at me steadily. "Their mistake," she said. Carol filed the emergency motion Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, we had a court order requiring the Callaways to restore access to the property immediately, pending the outcome of the proceedings. The order was served to Dwayne by a process server at 4 in the afternoon. He complied. He had no choice. I went back to my house that evening with the new key. I stood at the front door for a moment before I put it in the lock. The neighborhood was quiet. The streetlights were coming on. Somewhere down the block, someone was raking leaves. I opened the door and went inside. The house smelled the same. That was the first thing I noticed. Whatever they had done in there, and they had been inside, I could see small signs of it, things slightly displaced. The house still smelled like our life, like the particular combination of old wood and cooking and years that becomes the smell of home without you ever noticing it happening. I walked through every room. I checked everything. Then I sat down in the kitchen and called Lily, who was at school, and told her she could come home. The final ruling came in December, 6 weeks later. The judge found that Thomas Callaway had lacked testamentary capacity at the time the second will was signed on August 22nd. The medical documentation was clear and credible. The circumstances of the signing, arranged by Dwayne, witnessed by family associates, executed with no independent legal counsel advising Thomas, were deeply irregular. The original will, the one Thomas and I had made together years before, was reinstated as the valid document. The house was mine. It had always been mine. The law simply had to be persuaded to say what was already true. Carol called me with the ruling. I thanked her and sat with the phone in my hand for a while after we hung up. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that honestly. I felt something quieter and heavier than triumph. A kind of exhausted relief, the way you feel when a long illness finally breaks and you are left with the soreness of what you went through rather than the joy of recovery. I had won. But what I had won was what should never have been taken from me. And what had been taken, the year of fear, the grief compounded by betrayal, the sight of my daughter absorbing loss and then injustice in the same terrible year, none of that was given back by any ruling. I did not call Dwayne. I did not call Patricia or Ruth. Carol sent formal notification through the proper channels, and that was the end of my communication with the Calloway family. They have not reached out to me since. I do not expect them to. I think, in their version of the story, they are the aggrieved parties, the family that tried to protect what they saw as theirs and were thwarted by a stubborn woman and a sympathetic judge. I think Ruth still believes, somewhere in the composed certainty she carries like a piece of furniture, that she was owed that house. I have thought about whether I'm angry at them. I was for a long time. A cold, specific anger that sat in my chest like a stone and colored everything. It has faded mostly, not because I have forgiven them. I don't think forgiveness is required of me, and I won't pretend otherwise. But because carrying anger at people who feel no remorse is a tax on your own life, and I have paid enough taxes on this particular account. What I think about now, more than the Calloways, is Thomas. I think about who he was before the illness made him vulnerable. I think about the man who listened, who was patient, who built a life with me based on something that felt solid and true. I think about what it must have meant in those foggy, medicated weeks in August to have his brother sitting in the room with him. The brother he had trusted his whole life, asking him to sign something, reassuring him it was fine, it was for the family, it was what was right. I don't know exactly what was said. I wasn't there. But I know Thomas. I knew what he would have wanted. And it was not that. Whatever happened in that room, the man who signed that document was not fully Thomas. He was the body of the man I loved, worn down by disease and medication and pain, in a moment when he could not protect himself. And the people who used that moment knew exactly what they were doing. That is the thing I carry. Not the legal battle, not the locked doors, not even the year of fear. The thing I carry is the knowledge of what was done to my husband by people he trusted in the last months of his life. I carry it, and I let it make me someone who pays attention to vulnerability, to the moments when people cannot protect themselves and need someone to protect them instead. That is what I can do with it. It is spring now. Nearly 2 years since Thomas died, 8 months since the ruling came through. Lily is finishing her junior year of high school, already talking about college, already becoming someone I am proud of in ways I didn't know how to anticipate. The kitchen table is the same one that has been in this house for 16 years. The yard still needs work. It always will. The bedroom at the end of the hall is still a bedroom, ordinary and mine. Last week, I sat on the back porch in the late afternoon light and thought, for no particular reason, about the first time Thomas and I walked through this house with the realtor. How we stood in the kitchen and looked at each other over the realtor's head with that private marital shorthand. Yes, this one. This is it. We were right. It was it. Some things, once they are yours, remain yours, even when someone tries to take them. Even when the locks are changed and the papers are filed and the whole weight of someone else's certainty bears down on what you know to be true, you hold on. You find your Carol Sutherland. You listen to your daughter say, "their mistake," in a quiet voice that sounds like her father's. And you hold on. That is all I know how to tell you.